Hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Helena Bottemiller Evich. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Food Fix, which is a newsletter all about food policy in Washington and beyond. And I'm really delighted to be here today with a truly stellar panel of really the top food and agriculture reporters in the country, many of whom I've known for a long time. We are going to talk about election results and prospects for food and nutrition programs. And there is a lot to unpack. We're going to walk through some of the things that we are watching at a high level, and then we're going to have a discussion. We're going to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question as we go, you can drop it into the Q&A function of this platform, and we would be delighted to take questions from you. So to start us off, I'm going to introduce the panel. We have Marcia Brown, who is a food and agriculture reporter at Politico, my former home. I covered food there for nearly a decade. Marcia's been doing some great work. We have Ximena Bustillo, also an alum of Politico. She is now a political reporter at NPR. We work together at Politico, and she's a dear friend as well. And then we have Leah Douglas, who is a food and energy, or agriculture and energy reporter, at Reuters, which is obviously a massive platform and wire service that you probably all read. I'm sure that everyone on the panel has read stories from point or other. So we're delighted to get started here. Again, questions to the Q&A. I think we'll turn it over to each, just a couple of brief thoughts about what we're watching as everyone scrambles to try to unpack what the election mean for these issues. Briefly, I think that some of the main themes I'm watching is the kind of our typical Democrat on some key food, the extent to which those sides are still true. So I think in general, we have seen Democrats favor more, government intervention, more regulation, and then Republicans have been more deregulated. Is starting to get scrambled a little bit. It seems like, at least from the rhetoric that we're seeing, particularly with President-elect Donald Trump's alliance with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and some of the messaging that came out of the campaign in the final months or the final weeks, really, of the campaign around Make America Healthy Again. So trying to talk about diet-related diseases and shaking up, and in some cases maybe firing people at public health agencies. There's been a new focus on that issue. So that's one thing I'm watching. Like, have we scrambled some of the politics here where maybe Republicans want more government intervention? We're still waiting to see how that's going to all shake out. And then when you look at some of the nutrition programs, we haven't heard SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, come up really at all during this campaign, but there's a lot of questions now about what Republican control of Washington means for those programs, for that program and other nutrition programs. Democrats have tended to favor, higher benefit levels and expansion of eligibility, and that has traditionally not been the Republican standpoint on those issues. So a lot to watch there. I think when you look at school meals, another program that I watch closely, going back to the Make America Healthy Again thing, I'm watching to see any signs of how that will go going forward in terms of nutrition standards, any regulations around those programs. We can also talk about eligibility. So those are some of the key themes I'm watching. It is a time where I think all of my sources, I'm sure everyone on the panel agrees, all of our sources are much like you all, trying to figure out what comes next. What does the election mean for these programs? And so we are in a bit of a phase of having more questions than answers, but hopefully we can unpack some of the key, fault lines and trends and themes that we're watching. So Marcia, I'm actually going to pick on you first. Do you want to go ahead and give us just a couple of minutes of what you're watching? What are some of the key themes, just to ground the conversation, and we'll get everyone to answer that, and then we will continue from there.
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm excited for this conversation. A lot of really wonderful colleagues on this panel that I really enjoy reading all their work. So a couple of top line things that I have been watching as we, in the last, what has it been, 11 days, is first of all, what is the future of the Farm Bill? I think there was some hope that we were going to see a Farm Bill in the lame duck. Now that Republicans have clinched a trifecta, I do think that those hopes are not as likely now. But I did talk to Klobuchar yesterday, actually, and I asked her about this, and she wants to get it done. I mean, I think in the next Congress there's going to be a lot of focus on tax, and so I think there's a fear: will there be enough time to get done this complicated piece of legislation? And then I've also been covering a lot of bird flu stuff, just like Leah. And there is a question as this continues to kind of percolate through our dairy herds and poultry flocks. Like, will this have an effect on our food system? Will we see this have an effect on food prices? And what will the new administration kind of mean for that, for the response to that? And then the last thing, kind of like you've already talked about, we're watching RFK. I mean, I was just talking to a food lobbyist kind of right before this call who was just basically saying it's kind of like throwing darts at a board. We're trying to figure out what he means for so many different conversations around food policy, whether it's school lunches or the bird flu response or, vaccinations. There's just a lot of wild cards there with RFK and what his role will be in the next administration.
Yeah, I think wild cards is a good, good word for it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, Leah, you'll go next. You'll be like the Politico alumni sandwich. You're the only one who has not worked at Politico.
My favorite.
There's still time, Leah.
It's true. Yeah, don't count anything out. Yeah, I mean, ditto to everything that Marcia said. I mean, these are all issues that we're all going to be watching closely. I would say, from my end, other things to sort of put into the mix. I've been doing some early reporting and thinking about immigration policy under the next administration. Our food supply chain is heavily dependent on immigrant labor. And really nobody knows yet what how the campaign promises that Trump made around whether it's a mass deportation plan or new restrictions at the border, what those policies will actually look like and how it could translate into, the conditions, work conditions of, folks who are already here, path to citizenship, or, all of these questions are emerging about what's going to happen to this labor force, both for those individuals and for the industry. And there's some significant consumer implications for that as well. If there was a major labor disruption in the food supply chain, there would definitely be, impacts to availability of products. I mean, folks can just think back to the first year of COVID when we saw, mass illness among our food system workers and how there were disruptions. So we know how fragile and sort of carefully balanced everything is there. So that'll be definitely one area I'll be watching. Another area we're paying close attention to, which can feel kind of esoteric and far away, but is very related to these topics, is trade implications. This was another major campaign talking point for Trump, was about, instituting new tariffs, and farmers in the Midwest are definitely concerned about another trade war, which was something that happened under the first Trump administration, a trade war with China. And that also carries significant implications for consumer prices. But just to echo what's been said, definitely my sources as well are, gaming out different scenarios. But until we have all these, appointments in place and some policy making actually begins, it's hard to know, what the outcomes will be. So for now, can sort of cast ahead to some, general themes like watching consumer prices and of course, all the food policy issues as well.
Yeah. Okay, Ximena, we'll kick it to you. And I should have mentioned that you're a political reporter, but you are forever a food and ag reporter as well. And you still follow these issues in addition to covering like the whole waterfront of political issues. So what are you watching right now?
Yeah, I do default to being the food and ag person on our politics team, which, when SNAP becomes a thing during the debt limit again, means I'll be back on that. One thing I think here is I'm looking at things from a political perspective and then also a policy perspective, like the three of you. So from a political perspective, the first and foremost is who's going to get nominated to be the heads of a lot of these agencies, but not just head the agencies, but who's actually going to be in control. And those might actually be different sets of people coming from different branches of government. It's not like traditional, whoever's the secretary of, DHS is going to be the one that's going to be implementing mass deportation policy. We're seeing that is Stephen Miller, that's Tom Homan, other people out of a White House direct position, not necessarily who's nominated to be secretary. And so we are watching that for a bunch of different agencies, looking at HHS, looking at EPA, looking at USDA. The person who's actually tapped to lead that department and be in charge of that policy area is not necessarily the one that's going to be driving the ship, the one that's going to be calling the shots or encouraging what rules to really focus on or not focus on. And with that, how much does Congress have control over, who's making the decisions, who are the players on the Hill that are going to be very influential? I think a lot of that is still being decided. From a policy perspective, with a new administration, I am getting a little bit of a new role. So I'm pivoting to cover agencies again, and that's going to include DHS for the immigration side. And that means I, along with Leah, will be really closely paying attention to how immigration policy shapes up. And I think that's a really important conversation here, not just because of the obvious high statistic of undocumented workers that work in our food and ag system, but also our food and nutrition programs and who has access to them. And we have always seen, even before the pandemic, but particularly the pandemic, an issue of public charge being, a thing that drives people away from seeking benefits, even if they qualify for it, or if they live in mixed status families and households. And so I think that is one thing that I'm really going to be watching for, is how a lot of these different policies really change and shape, in addition to, the broader landscape and just our food supply system, that is going to be really fragile as well.
Yeah. And I want to, maybe this is a good time to dig into that a little bit, because you're so right that the immigration element here, like on its face, maybe people don't think about that as being a food policy issue. I believe, most things are food policy issues. Like, you can find the food angle in anything, but it really is a food story in two ways, right? It is the access, not only the access to nutrition programs, but also food insecurity is a lot higher for certain immigrant communities, particularly undocumented immigrants. We know that. And the fear around accessing nutrition programs, as you mentioned, with the fear that it would affect future immigration proceedings, has really tamped down a lot of use of those programs. And then in the other part of that vein, which people don't think about being connected, is that if you constrain the labor, as Leah mentioned, like, you could increase food prices, which we know is now one of the drivers of food insecurity. So I don't know, Leah, maybe talk a little bit about food prices angle. I'm not sure who has the fire truck. You might want to mute for a sec, but it's passing. But Leah, do you want to talk a little bit about food prices and how you're following that and how that fits into this? Because it sometimes is the issue that we don't always think is directly tied to like food security, but it very much is.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And I mean, to tie it into the election itself, we know that food prices were a huge concern of voters. And, there's been plenty of diagnostics about how each party, handled that in their messaging, for better or worse. One sort of step back piece of context going into all these conversations is that we know that hunger has actually been rising in the US sort of in like an unprecedented way in the past couple of years, because the pandemic aid assistance, additional food assistance that we saw during COVID, sort of for a couple of years, artificially made it seem like hunger rates were steady. But once that aid was rolled back last year, we actually saw that inflation was creating like a real squeeze and actually exacerbating hunger rates. So that's, I think, an under-discussed element of like the politics of where we are now, is that there's real data backing up that people are having a hard time, feeding their households, and how that has played out in the election. So when we're thinking about, like you said, constraining a labor supply, a labor source, I think that it's just really under realized among the general public, like how dependent our food sector is on undocumented workers and workers who are legally in the US, but on the immigration system as a whole. There really is like no daylight. And, you know, we're talking about specific populations. We're talking about our like field workers who are working in like very, you know, highly skilled positions, picking produce, picking vegetables, things that are very difficult or impossible to automate those types of jobs. We're talking about dairy workers who work year round in milk processing facilities. We're talking about folks who pick and pack produce in the Pacific Northwest and turn it into applesauce. We're talking about folks who work in meat packing plants in the Southeast, you know, processing poultry. I mean, this is very wide reaching. A lot of products that we consume every day that are, you know, the price and availability of those products is just directly tied to this labor source. So, you know, that's an area where that we might start to see some tension between the campaign promises, between different campaign promises, right? There's a promise of lowering food prices, and there's a promise around some sort of immigration reform and also aggressive tariffs. So sort of remains to be seen how an administration could accomplish all those things at once.
Yeah. It is, I think, underappreciated. I think that link is. There's a saying in agriculture, which is maybe overly simplistic, but I always think about it. It's you either import labor or food. And some of the, and that's not true for every commodity, but for certain things like fruits and vegetables, dairy, some of the parts of the food system that really are very reliant on, you know, highly skilled, but, you know, labor that a lot of Americans don't want to do. That is just a piece of I think it's absolutely a piece of the system that, that folks, you know, are underappreciative. Or I think during COVID, we saw a little bit more of a light shined on that, but it's not always something where people connect those dots. I want to pivot back to the Farm Bill because so much of particularly SNAP, our, you know, largest nutrition assistance program, is tied into that in terms of policy. Marcia, you mentioned that you had talked to Klobuchar, which we maybe want to explain that Klobuchar is probably going to be the top Democrat on the Senate Agriculture Committee next year. And so she will be a key player because Debney Stabenow, our current chairwoman, is retiring after a long run. I believe she was the second woman to hold that role, first woman to, I think, oversee that committee when they were writing a farm bill. So Klobuchar is a key player, but like, where do we foresee the farm bill actually going? And do you think the election results change a lot of the politics around SNAP? Or are we going to probably see kind of the run of the mill Republicans are trying to rein in that program, and that's where the fight's going to be? Like, has anything been scrambled there, or are we just kind of kicking the can to the same fight down the road? I know you spend a good amount of time on the Hill, so tell us what are you seeing there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there are also still a lot of questions. As I said earlier, I think the fact that we now know there's a trifecta does kind of give Republicans a lot more bargaining power than they had in the last Congress, which makes them more likely to kind of want to wait until they have both chambers and they can write the farm bill that they want. And just to back up a little bit for our listeners, the big dividing lines, the reason we didn't see a farm bill for the last, I guess, couple of years now at this point, is there were issues around SNAP and the funding it was receiving, and issues around major conservation money that originally came from the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was basically Republicans wanted to move some of that money into the farm safety net, so commodity sports and things like that, reference prices. And Democrats obviously wanted to defend their signature bill. And so what we had was sort of an impasse where lawmakers didn't want to give an inch on either one. And Democrats were also trying to defend SNAP and make sure that there weren't any more kind of restrictions put on the program. I think what's interesting with SNAP too is that Republicans have already achieved kind of increased work requirements for that program. And so going into the next Congress, I'll be really interested to see like what are the kind of their next goals on that program and kind of reining it in. I think one of their big targets is probably going to be the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the way that USDA basically decides how much money people receive in the program, and USDA oversaw an update to the Thrifty Food Plan, which expanded SNAP benefits. And kind of to Leah's point, what's interesting there is that was a huge expansion actually, and it really didn't do a lot in terms of people's food security, in the sense that like a lot of people are still struggling. More people are relying on these programs, especially with the end of the child tax credit and other supports. So I think that those will be some targets. They're the Thrifty Food Plan. We already saw that in the House version of the Farm Bill, which lawmakers voted on earlier this year. So they could do an extension, a 1-year extension in the lame duck, which they're going to have to do something because the Farm Bill will expire. So that is going to happen. We may see parts of the Farm Bill also showing up in other funding bills that have to kind of pass. So I think that's kind of where we are at this point. What's interesting too is that a lot of the Democrats on the House Ag Committee did hold on to their seats. They were in competitive races. And 3 of the 4 Democrats that voted for the GOP House Farm Bill did also keep their seats. And so I think that's kind of an interesting picture to think about there.
Yeah, and just to dig into the Thrifty Food Plan a little bit more, because I think there isn't as much recognition of like what that is, but it did, as you mentioned, result in a really significant increase in SNAP benefits. I think it was like 21% overall. And I think the Biden administration will really point to that as one of their big accomplishments. But it came at a time, as was mentioned earlier, that a lot of the other pandemic era aid was going away. In the last year and a half, we've stopped doing universal free school meals. We stopped doing the emergency allotments, which were the stepped up SNAP payments that brought up a lot more people to the maximum payment level. I mean, there were so many. And then, earlier in the pandemic, of course, we had stimulus payments and all of the, or not stimulus payments,
Summer meals. I mean, that's a big one too, where that was, temporary, and then they did make it permanent, but states had to opt in. So you have a lot of states that just didn't opt in. So that's actually a retraction of a benefit, right? If you're a family that you relied on that, it made your life easier in the summer. Well, now you don't have that. So that, people notice these things,
And I think the overall trajectory there in terms of, so I was just writing about, this fall has been a blur, but several weeks ago, the food insecurity numbers came out, and, we're seeing food insecurity go up. And one of the things that I reflected on as we were seeing those numbers is in the future, there really isn't, and this is probably particularly true, but this was already true, but this is particularly true with Republicans taking control of the White House and Congress. There is no future in the near term where you see nutrition benefits expanding. That's not on the table. That's not in the realm of possibilities. And so it does seem like we are in a time when food insecurity could continue to go up. Now, of course, there's macroeconomic issues that affect that a lot. But employment is pretty high right now. Wages need to go up. There's all these other, all these other factors that fuel into that. But just looking at what the government is able to do in terms of food and nutrition security, there is no one predicting an expansion coming anytime soon. So I think that is sort of a reality check. And we're definitely getting that reality check very much with the election outcome. I want to remind everyone that you can put questions in the Q&A box to ask this panel of reporters. Someone asked a question that I'm not sure if it's tongue in cheek, but it's asking about beef tallow. I don't know if anyone following the Make America Healthy Again stuff has followed that. You're all looking at me with blank stares. I think what this person is getting at is potentially how will diet advice or nutrition advice change during I don't know how to turn off these things. Sorry. How will nutrition advice potentially change because of the election? Maybe I will start by just noting that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, so the dietary guidelines are official nutrition advice that we have for the country. By law, they're updated every 5 years, and a big panel of scientists gets together and like reviews all the science. And then issues a scientific report to HHS and USDA, that's Health and Human Services, and the Department of Agriculture. And then those two agencies work together and write updated guidelines. And so the reason this matters from an anti-hunger perspective is that those guidelines inform the standards for and the requirements for major nutrition programs, whether it's school meals or CACF. And so we do watch this with great interest, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But the committee, the expert committee, just finished its work, and I think we should know soon, or the scientific report should be out soon. But then the next administration is actually going to take that report and issue new dietary guidelines. So we are going to see that happen. I don't know the answer to the extent to, the question of will dietary advice change in a new administration because of all of this new interest in, diet related diseases. And there's a lot of mistrust around all experts of all kinds, but particularly institutions like USDA are under a lot of fire for, in nutrition science, there's a lot of industry funding. And so there's been a lot of concerns about conflicts of interest. So I don't know the answer. This is a good question. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about nutrition, particularly in this moment. I mean, if any of you are spending time on Instagram or TikTok or really any social media platform, like you are going to see more conversation around these issues. Everyone's nodding. I don't know. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Are you seeing the nutrition conversation change? This is obviously going to affect these nutrition programs down the line if this thread continues.
Sure, I can jump in really quickly. I think just on the regulatory side, I think one thing that is kind of, again, a wild card with our RFK and the Make America Healthy Again movement is a lot of what he is calling for, first of all, could be ripped from like a lot of progressive playbooks. But then also, would typically, you would think, require new regulations. But the administration that he's a part of is very anti-regulatory. So how that will land, I think, again, is a wild card. But two things that I'm watching in this sort of dietary guidelines, not the official, but just dietary nutrition realm are, we're expecting some proposed rule from the FDA on front of pack labeling. Now, where does RFK stand on that? Does he think that that's a really important part of how people can, be healthier? We still don't really know that, but I think that will be maybe a really interesting indicator. Or is, the front of pack labeling something that becomes an immediate target for a rollback in the next administration? We also have the voluntary sodium reduction guidelines from the FDA. Again, I don't know the specifics of where RFK stands on that, but I think that those are just two regulatory examples of, what we could see on the nutrition side and where I think that could be kind of revealing about, what RFK, when he, when and if he gets involved in the governing side of things, what that really looks like.
Yeah, I do think that's like a central question, how that deregulatory sort of stance can fit in with some of the agenda items. One of the ones, this is a little bit far afield of maybe like directly what folks in the anti-hunger community are focused on, but the key example there is additives. So there's been a big push in like California. Well, this is related to school meals actually. So, there's been a big there's been 2 bills in California to ban certain food additives. One of them actually targets artificial food dyes in school meals programs. And this is obviously regulatory, right? Like if you're going to ban something, like that is taking a government action, right? And the big argument I see online is like, Europe doesn't allow these things. Why are we allowing them? And, that really boils down to like Europe regulates their food much more strictly in terms of what they actually allow in terms of additives. And that's a regulatory philosophy that we have not adopted, and particularly Republicans have not adopted in the past. So I totally agree with you. Like, that is a real wild card and will probably reveal a lot about like where we're headed. It is sort of I would say that side of things has been much more scrambled ideologically than the kind of traditional politics around like federal nutrition programs and nutrition assistance. I haven't seen that scrambled. Like, I feel like that kind of holds in the traditional pattern, but we'll see. I feel like I'm going to stop predicting what's going to happen because I've been surprised several times during this election cycle. So we have a question from someone in the audience wanting to know about how the election may impact federally funded child nutrition programs, such as school meals. They're talking about like the waivers we had during the pandemic, which really allowed for basically universal. And I think this is a good opportunity to talk about universal school meals. Where do we see that issue going? And did the election change that trajectory? I don't know who wants to weigh in. Ximena, I feel like you were on the you were on the campaign trail. There was a brief moment where we thought universal school meals might get some air.
Yeah.
Walls of Minnesota overseeing that. So I don't know, but kind of did that turn out, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think in an alternate universe with different election results, it might have been a different conversation. The minute that Harris selected Walz as her running mate, that became a big part of the conversation for like 2 weeks. Suddenly everyone was writing about free meals. I forgot that Tim Walz was the governor with the photo of all the kids hugging him, and that from just like a year or two ago. And Harris's own home state of California obviously also has a universal meals program, and other states out west do as well. So it did become a part of the conversation, not necessarily something that the campaign talked about, though, which is one thing that I'll note. So Walz did go on that DNC stage, and he did tout that he did that for his state, but he, never necessarily ran on free school meals for all. That's not necessarily something that was a part of Harris's economic platform either, even when she talked about price gouging. I think maybe there were, allusions to increasing access and kind of things like that, but never an explicit like running on, free school meals for all. Obviously, the current Republican ticket is probably very unlikely to support universal school meals for all. And as Marcia mentioned earlier, kind of with the trifecta, which is like what we call when the House, the Senate, and the presidency are all under one party. I mean, it just on the Hill has politically not been popular for Republicans to support universal school meals for all. Even though, at the local level, there are some Republican governors and there are some, Republican school board leaders that have supported it and have pushed it through. But honestly, I think I've seen that movement kind of like slow down over the past, I'd say 3 years. My first year at NPR, pivoting from Politico, I was doing a lot of legislative tracking on different legislatures that were trying to pass free school meals, even like states like New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont was in there, other states as well. New Mexico was obviously very successful, and since then, I mean, it has kind of like petered out. So seeing that federally that's something that's not going to happen, I think I would be interested to see what state legislatures decide to do this legislative cycle come January. Is this something that comes back in any way, shape, or form? Are there states that continue to pursue this? Are there other states that don't? I think that's probably where more of the legislative change is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The states are absolutely must watch in a situation where that issue is not going to get any traction federally. And I think that's a pretty safe bet. We did get a question about like the political implications at the state level, because it's not just, universal free school meals, but they're also, we mentioned earlier that like summer EBT opting into that is state by state. And there are still many states that have not adopted or not opted into that program, which in some cases leaves hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in nutrition benefits, and like it leaves it on the table. Those states can't access those. Does anyone think that the election results change any of the political calculations around that? Like food prices were a huge issue. Economic and stress seems to be obviously a big issue. Like, do you think that helps summer EBT at all, or some of the state political calculations?
You know, I can kind of jump in there a little bit. I think the states that already have it and that are in it are going to try to keep it. And, you know, if this is a program that goes away under a new administration, kind of seeing how states make up for that, you know, through, you know, their legislative process, I think is something to really watch. The states that don't do it and haven't done it are probably going to continue to not. You know, Idaho is one of them. So Idaho is like my home state. And I remember working at the Idaho Statesman and covering how they were the last state to join the program that was just given to them at the very start of the pandemic in 2020. And to this day, they're still not a part of this program that they can sign up for. I don't see Governor Brad Little moving on that anytime soon. And so, you know, if anything, it probably is just kind of affirming to the states that haven't moved the needle on it, that they can continue to just hold a hard line against joining that kind of a policy. The states that are a part of it are probably game planning what to do should it go away. And if they're not, they probably should be.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to back up, in case some folks aren't aware, I know everyone watching works on like different pieces of the nutrition safety net. Pandemic EBT, which was, you know, obviously program stood up during the pandemic to try to replace some of the school meal benefits. That is what essentially turned into summer EBT. Like it was the precursor. So now states have the ability to replace those school meals with EBT benefits, or the value of them, I should say, during the summer. And that's what states are opting into or not. And so sometimes I almost call it PEBT because it's like, feels to me the same thing and was born out of that. But that's just a little bit of background there. So that's helpful. I think that's a good point. I don't know the mechanics of, I'm trying to think, like, I mean, Congress made that it permanent and Congress gave funding for that. But, you know, looking forward, trying to bet that anything is permanent is like probably not wise. Like, I don't know that would be like a top target, but I hadn't really thought about that program in particular. I think I've been thinking more about the Farm Bill and SNAP and, you know, where all that is headed.
I mean, what is the government efficiency something or other that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to lead? What does that mean for these programs? I mean, like those significant cuts could mean that we see major changes to these programs like WIC or SNAP or summer meals. So
most of that would have to be agreed to by Congress. Certainly they can make policy changes, but I mean, expanding CEP and things like that, I think you can do that without Congress, but you can't you can't eliminate government programs without Congress. But who knows? I really don't know. I think we're just getting to the point where everyone's starting to go, oh yeah, what about that issue? Oh yeah, what about that program? And we are, you know, in early days. We had a question about where there can be bipartisan agreement, which is a good one. And this questioner works on like SNAP fruit and vegetable incentives, produce prescriptions, food as medicine. Those are areas where we have seen more bipartisan agreement. Does anyone have thoughts about, are there, like, where going forward, maybe the Farm Bill is a good place to look, like, is there likely to be like bipartisan agreement? Maybe that's an easier place to focus because there's obviously going to be some pretty serious disagreements. Does anyone have thoughts about, or are all the bipartisan issues still the same as they were? Who has thoughts? Leah, I'm calling on you. But where is the bipartisan harmony? We're talking about all the things we're going to disagree on, but
I mean, I think those issues are, you know, wise ones to pull out, you know, programs that are sort of ancillary to SNAP and WIC, but that do expand benefits. Yeah, I would say those are ones in general where there's historically been more both bipartisanship and creativity around how to implement these programs that have gone on to be hugely popular. Doesn't seem outside the realm that someone like RFK would be a champion for something like food as medicine. So I think that, in many ways we have a very similar makeup in terms of votes than we did before the election. So Congress is going to be dealing with a very similar set of, there's going to be a hard right constituency in the House, then there's going to be sort of the center, then there's going to be the center left, and then there's going to be the far left, which is not nearly as, oppositional to the center of the Democratic Party as the right wing is to the center right. But we're going to see like a similar sort of fights. I mean, the majority in the House is meaningful in terms of the additional, power that it gives Republicans. However, they will still need to capture bipartisanship to get through, especially the more significant a change is, like the more there's going to be resistance from kind of all over the place. And it doesn't always come necessarily left to right. I know that, sources have been talking to me about the Republican Party needing to be strategic about something like the Farm Bill. How can you even get this done when there's a very significant right wing of the party that is just opposed to farm subsidies? And if you're going into the next session, if you're waiting for the next session to pass the Farm Bill, are you going to have to tackle that head on? Whereas now, maybe you could just sort of get it done and, get the Democratic votes and not have to deal with a newly empowered right wing of the party that is going against even farm industry interests there. So that's just to say, I think with a lot of these questions, what's going to happen to certain programs, what's going to happen to certain funding levels, the higher the intervention level needs to be to interrupt that program, the more Congress needs to work at it, generally speaking. There's things that can be done with executive action and agencies, but so the party in charge, in this case, the Republicans, are going to be thinking about how much energy they want to spend on each thing and how much floor time they have to vote on each thing and on and on. So I would just offer that as like that's sort of the metric I use to understand how much are we going to hear about certain issues. Are they going to take the time to dismantle produce prescriptions? Maybe not though. We don't know, but that's how some of the politicians will be thinking about it, I guess, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that is important to note, just like how tight the Republican majority is going to be in the House and how precarious that is, particularly on issues where you lose folks on the right. And the Farm Bill has that problem, as you noted. And the other thing just related to that vein that I think is underappreciated is that you still have the Farm Bill's like general challenge with getting through the House, which is like threading the exact needle you're talking about. But now with this Make America Healthy Again movement and sort of faction within the Republican Party that has been adopted at like the highest echelons of the Trump apparatus, they talk a lot about subsidies and wanting to change agricultural subsidies and change the way our agricultural system works. And like, that would be an uphill political battle on Capitol Hill. And if you have enough folks within the Republican Party who are now part of that worldview, or want to see major changes in the Farm Bill, like Leah's absolutely right. Like the bar to getting something like that through Congress is really high, especially when you're talking about making big changes that large swaths of industry would disagree with you on, maybe fight on. So in some ways, the Farm Bill politics could get a lot more complicated, even though it would appear like, oh, it'd be easier because you have like one party control essentially. But I think you're absolutely right that like any big move is going to be difficult still, but we'll see. I don't know. I think it's like it's just a crazy time, and people keep asking me about like my predictions, and I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I'm saying I don't know a lot, which is good. You should admit when you don't know what's going to happen. We just got another question about RFK. Does RFK want to disband the FDA, and can that happen realistically? Who wants to take that one? Marcia, how about you? I know you're following this. Does RFK disband the FDA, and can that happen realistically?
I would say that this is probably something, like you said earlier, would require some congressional buy-in. So
Yeah,
it
no.
seems like it would be hard in that sense. But I do also think that there's a lot of anger at the FDA from a lot of different parts of Congress. And there's been like a long running, push to kind of rethink how we regulate food when it comes to food safety. And like, do we need a singular agency? I mean, it's kind of, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I mean, I guess anything is possible.
Yeah, and I would just say, oh, sorry, Ximena, you go.
No. Yeah, weigh in. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I would just say, like, this is another area where I don't have a prediction. But how I think about it is, what would be the countervailing forces, right? So one of them is Congress. Another huge one is industry. I mean, this is the same thing with farm subsidies. The thing that any like large capitalist enterprise hates the most is like significant change. Significant change is like usually not good for profits, no matter what. Even if the end goal is higher profits in the interim, it's not great. And, huge amounts of industry. I mean, we're talking about food, but the majority of the FDA is in pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, that's an agency that huge amounts of industry and trillions of dollars are dependent on running smoothly. So RFK is a prominent voice, and he's giving voice to a lot of, what we're seeing now is like a latent opinion in a significant number of policymakers. However, like, there are significant obstacles there that, because we haven't seen policy plans, we really have no sense of what's his ideas beyond the FDA should be dismantled. Okay, what's step 1 through 101 of doing that? We really don't know. So it's feasibility, again, hard to predict, but that's how I think about it. It's just there would be significant force against that.
Yeah.
I would also add sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just super quickly, like on the industry side too. I mean, it's not just, that they don't like destabilization. That's like the big picture part of it. But I mean, it's not a great for your business if listeria is everywhere. I mean, that's just not a good thing. And so you're not necessarily going to favor dismantling an entire regulatory system if you're worried about like things getting worse. People are not going to buy your products anymore. And I mean, I think the complicating factor of that is that it feels like there's a lot of listeria outbreaks right now. So, what is, and I think there's a lot of questions around why is this happening? Why, I mean, so yes to everything Leah said, and just yes. And,
yeah, it's an interesting thing to remember that the food industry very much supported increased food safety regulations because it was a lot of these really costly foodborne illness outbreaks were so expensive for businesses to deal with. They were hurting consumer confidence. They were absolutely hurting public health, but they were also like the business case was made that it was very bad to continue down this road. So you're right that there's like a complicated relationship. It's not just like industry doesn't want any regulation. Ximena, you were about to jump in.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'll add to this is that there are a lot of ways to slow agencies down without disbanding them, and a lot of ways to slow down rulemaking, slow down processes. We saw during the past Trump administration that he didn't appoint people to certain roles, like leadership positions just went vacant, straight up federal hiring freezes for the federal workforce, and that really, really slows things down. Congress can also slow down agencies in certain ways. We still don't have a Secretary of Labor, by the way, for the Biden administration, because one has not been confirmed. And, there are ways that, different branches can work around each other, but there are also a lot of ways to slow agencies down. That being said, we don't really know the approach that this administration is going to take to federal agencies. And I think that different agencies are just going to get different treatment. Agencies also have different power. So, kind of speaking to what the three other gals were saying, the pharmaceutical industry is like very, very, very strong in a way that maybe teachers unions for the Department of Ed might not be. No offense to teachers unions, but there's just different power dynamic there, different investment in politics and, what have you. And so things are going to look different everywhere. I don't think, knock on wood, I guess, I don't know, but I don't think it's going to be a one size fits all. What you do to USDA, you also do to Interior, and you also do that to HHS. I don't know, maybe it will be, but I think that it will be very, very case by case. And that does make policy issues really tricky, particularly like food and ag, because they stretch across everything. You have USTR, you have HHS, you have, USDA, you have DOL for the labor stuff. So it does make it complicated to track and follow. Doesn't help, but those are kind of the things I was thinking about.
I think that's absolutely right. And the extent to which the president himself takes an interest in an issue like immigration or trade, I think those are issues that are much more likely to have decisions made at the very highest echelons, whereas something like what we're doing on climate smart commodities, like that's going to be a decision made by the agriculture secretary, which is why it's so consequential who those decision makers are. Same thing with SNAP, CEP, like lots of these, more in the weeds issues, like those are going to be more likely to be decided by an ag secretary, because those are not things that President-elect Trump is waking up and thinking about.
Or I think like at the very least, like further down the road, like when we're thinking about like day one priorities and first 100 day, like I don't think passing a farm bills in his first 100-day plan, or even maybe in his year one plan, but it might be in his year two plan right before midterms. Making some changes might be further down the road. Who knows though? I mean, maybe he wakes up one day and he's like, pandemic EBT. I don't know,
Yeah, we'll have to see. So another question we got, which I think is a good one to end on in the final stretch here, is what can advocates do to elevate the issue of food insecurity, both to elected officials, and then also, I'm going to add, this isn't part of the question, maybe also on social media, because we don't often see food insecurity as an issue as part of this. Like I can't think of ever hearing it during this election cycle, or at least presidential election cycle. Just general thoughts on like how that issue is talked about, like messaging that works or doesn't around that. Does anyone have thoughts about that? Like how the issue gets raised? It's not an easy one. I will say really quickly, one of the things I've been thinking about after the election is how much more decentralized and disparate like all of the like information consumption is now, and how just like the big role that podcasts played and the big role that like social media influencers played in this election in terms of people getting their information. And it's something I've been reflecting a lot on, like the role of the mainstream media versus like individual people and influencers like talking about issues. And I think that might be one of the ways that, like, if individual people on the internet are talking about issues that are important to him, like that to them, that might be just as important as whether or not the issues are covered in the press. Because the way we're consuming information has changed so much. It's hard to acknowledge that as like a reporter who's, worked in the mainstream media, now has my own independent newsletter. But I don't know. I think those dynamics have shifted a lot. I don't know if anyone has general thoughts about that, but an issue like food insecurity that affects so many people and yet isn't really covered a lot in the mainstream media is maybe a good example of like a hole there. So
yeah, I think, just add to that.
Yeah.
No, go for it.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the one way to kind of look at this is focus in on kind of retraction of programs. I mentioned this earlier. I mean, I was in Pennsylvania a lot right before the weeks of the election, talking to people about food prices, and people blame the party in power, and Biden oversaw this expansion of SNAP through the Thrifty Food Plan that we talked about, but he also oversaw the retraction of a lot of really critical benefits that lowered child food insecurity. And so it's not hard for people to blame the party in power, to blame Democrats, to blame Biden for that. And so if Republicans, if, you know, the president goes after some of these programs, or, you know, and they just want to shrink the spending on these programs, I mean, people will notice that. And I think, you know, talking to those people maybe is a way to make the issue, you know, hit the, like, you know, raise the issue in the media. But yeah, I think that's an area that I'm going to be watching too, is like how people respond if some of these programs are curtailed or retracted or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Someone is in the chat saying that there is a campaign focusing on social media influencers and content to kind of drive conversation around ending hunger. I did not know that. Thank you, Jerry. It's endhungerusa2030.org. I guess that's specific to content creators. I do think we are in a place where that is like playing an increasing role. And podcasts. If you want to talk about food insecurity, apparently podcasts are the way to go. A lot of people listen to podcasts. I think some people are calling this the podcast election. I always try to say yes to podcasts as well. I think there's a lot of folks who get their information that way. Does anyone have any closing thoughts about this? Like, is there any issue that we didn't touch on in terms of what you're watching in the election? Is there anything, and then maybe quickly, how we'll end on like how the audience can follow your work and maybe be informed that way? Like reading all of the articles that you guys are reading. Social media is important, but so is reporting, of course. We're journalists. Ximena, let's start with you. Any closing thoughts on, and then how do we follow you?
I mean, I think closing thoughts are who's to say a little bit. We've all done a really good job hedging a lot of the questions with context of what we've heard and how things could go. But, you know, I think that what we're looking at is a 4 years of changes. You know, I think that because at least 2 years of changes until we see what happens with the midterms. And we just don't know what those changes are going to be, to what magnitude, at what speed. And, you know, it's possible that things we're talking about now, we don't see the impacts of for like 5 years until the next election. You know, that's kind of what happened with the pandemic and how policy and regulation moves. It's very slow. So those are kind of, I don't know if those are good closing thoughts, but those are kind of my closing thoughts. In terms of where to follow my work, I do use my Instagram a lot for work and reporting, and I'm increasingly moving away from Twitter, and I am moving onto Blue Sky once my new role and coverage areas are formalized. So I'll still have a Twitter, but obviously mostly just for monitoring. But I won't really be posting my work, much less engaging with sources on it.
Got it. Okay, Marcia, closing thoughts and where can we find you?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to be really interested in seeing what happens with RFK. The last thing I'll just say about that is some of the people that I'm talking to, it's a lot of conjecture, I will say, but some people are also kind of wondering, how long will he last? Like, is he going to stay in Trump's orbit, or is he kind of Icarus? And then in terms of trying to find me, I am on Twitter, X, I guess. I also just joined Blue Sky, and I'm also trying to get a Threads account. So I'm trying to be more available, would love to meet new sources. And you can read our work at Politico.com, or if you're on the pro side as well, that's great too.
Yeah, and you can read Weekly Agriculture.
Yes, Weekly Ag for free. And I have a Signal and a Proton Mail, so yeah.
Love it. Yeah, this is you should send all your hot tips to these reporters. Okay, Leah, closing thought and where we can find you. We are right on time.
Yeah, my closing thought was going to be similar to that note. You know, I've been encouraging all my sources to just please tell me what's going on. You know, if you're following something that's like a niche, you know, that is not niche to you, but is like a specific nutrition program or is like a state level campaign, in these times of significant change, there is so much to follow. And, you know, please, like, don't be shy about reaching out to reporters, especially us, to like say what's going on. This is an important issue. I haven't seen you cover it. You know, can we hop on the phone for 10 minutes and talk about it? Because I'm on all the platforms as well. You can find me on Twitter, etc. But honestly, I'm mostly on my email and professionally. And that's like where I get a lot of great information, is just, you know, folks kind of helping me view the landscape, because it's hard to keep track of everything. So yeah, and I encourage everyone to read Reuters. We cover everything in the world, and I think very well for $1 a week.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a great note to end on. Yeah, so many people watching this actually know what's going on. So please get in touch with reporters and give us the scoop. Tell us what is important, what we should be following. That's another great way to get these issues covered in a substantive way. And thank you so much for your attention today. I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator so that we can stay on time. Thank you so much.